Hi, and welcome back to Wandering to Wellbeing for our next episode, and thanks for joining us. We're very pleased to be part of Team Bath's Stay and Workout activity timetable. I'm Keith Goddard, an occupational psychologist and sport and exercise psychologist, and I'm joined by my colleague today, Aurea Fellows, who's also an occupational psychologist, but a nutritional therapist as well. We are Reason to Be. We're an organisation that strives to help people to thrive, not just survive. We enjoy supporting people in daring to dream, whatever that dream might be. In this episode of Wellbeing, we're going to look at nutritional well-being. And in particular, we're going to look at blood sugar balance. So I'd like to hand over to Aurea, who's going to kick us off.
Thanks, Keith. So something that's really central to our nutritional well-being and our health and our energy generally, that is very much within our control, is blood sugar balance. And just going to explain a little bit about what we mean by this and why it's so important. So at any one time in the body, the amount of blood sugar, or glucose as it's known, is very tightly controlled, because actually there's a very narrow range in which the level of sugar in the blood is optimal for the body to perform effectively. Very much like body temperature or pH, there's actually a very narrow range that we need, and either too much or too little really causes problems for lots of different systems in the body. So as a result, it's very tightly controlled, and the body responds to what we do in terms of the food that we eat and the sugar that releases into the blood. So when we eat a meal that releases energy into the bloodstream very quickly, that's very easily absorbed, what we have is a very rapid response, a real spike in the amount of glucose in the blood. And the body responds to this to bring it down by releasing the hormone insulin. But in that insulin release to bring the level down, what typically happens is our blood sugar then drops quite low and often can dip below the minimum level that we're looking for. And what this means is that we can often at that point feel a bit lethargic, our energy can be affected, and also it prompts a very strong urge to eat, which is also controlled by other hormones in the body, which means that we can end up either eating a bit too much or constantly struggling with a feeling of hunger if we're not giving in to that. So what we need, instead ideally of riding this kind of peaks and troughs of blood sugar and insulin through the day, is to have a more stable release of energy and sugar from the food that we eat into the bloodstream, so that we're not having to ride those peaks and troughs and have those energy drops and feelings of tiredness as a result. And the other reason it's also important when it comes to our nutritional well-being is that response to the rise and fall of blood sugar actually uses up nutrients and building blocks which are being diverted away from other systems and processes in the body, which can actually exacerbate the feeling of tiredness that we feel as a response. So what we want is that nice, slow, gradual release of energy and glucose into our bloodstream from what we're eating, so we're not having big peaks and troughs, and we're just having nice, gentle rises and falls throughout the day. So how do we achieve that? That's the question I can see that you're all wanting to move on to. Well, the source of food that we eat that directly releases glucose into the bloodstream are the types of carbohydrate that we eat. And so what we ideally want to do is to make good choices around the types of carbohydrate that we're including in the diet, and particularly those ones that are nice and slow in the way that they are digested and absorbed, so that energy is released nice and slowly, as I said. And they would be the forms of carbohydrate that I described as more complex. So ones where there are still in the whole grain format that they would have perhaps been in originally, with a lot more of the fibre still intact. So here we'd be thinking about things like brown rice, whole grain bread, oats, or vegetables, because vegetables are a great source of carbohydrate that also come pre-packed with lots of good fibre, which helps to slow the release. So very much being very careful in our choice of the types of carbohydrate that we can include is one first step that we can take. The other thing that we can do in relation to carbohydrates is also to think about the frequency that we're eating carbohydrates, particularly those that are more starchy, sometimes referred to as the kind of beige carbohydrates, if you like, because they are often that kind of colour. So thinking about things like rice and bread and potatoes, and really making sure that we are probably eating those only once a day. So rather than having them as a core feature of breakfast and lunch and dinner, as well as snacks as well, maybe, just thinking about having them included in one of those. And what we can do then is to swap them out for other things. So we can switch out for vegetables, we can switch them out for things like beans and pulses and forms of carbohydrate that are slower releasing. So just as an example, if you think about lunch, it could be as easy as swapping out your sandwich for something which is more like a nice rounded salad with perhaps some beans or some sweet corn in it, or something like a quinoa bowl where you've got a mixture of veg and protein in with a nice slow releasing form of carbohydrate like quinoa. And of course, the other thing that we need to bring into the equation when we're thinking about the type of carbohydrate in the diet is to only eat those that are very highly refined occasionally. So because they tend to be the ones that are digested and absorbed very rapidly, these are also the ones that cause the greatest spike in our blood sugar. So things like very obvious foods and drinks, like something like a can of Coke or a biscuit or a piece of cake would have that response. But also we need to think about highly refined carbohydrates that you would get in things like white bread and white pasta, and also in things like breakfast cereals and also fruit juice, which you might generally consider to be quite healthy. But all of those things cause that rapid increase in blood sugar that we're trying to reduce and dampen down. So if we have the occasional spike, it's not too much of an issue, but we want to avoid that up and down roller coaster all the time. So eating these things more occasionally will help to do that. The other thing with carbohydrates, though, is not just thinking about which ones we eat and how often we eat them, but also thinking about when we're putting them together in our diet, what we're eating them with. And Keith's going to talk a little bit more about that now and what the strategy is that we can use there.
Thanks, Aurea. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time just talking about combining different types of food. As Aurea said, what we're trying to do is to get some slow release energy into our system and try and keep our energy up to the day, up through the day. And hopefully that will help us not snack as much. So one thing to think about if you're going to eat carbohydrates, whether they be slow release or the more starchy ones, is to combine them with the other types of food. So one of the big things to ask yourself whenever you're eating, whether it be a snack, a meal, breakfast, etc., is where's my protein? So when you're looking at what you're eating, is there any protein in that? And one of the ways to combine carbohydrates healthily is to look at protein, but also to look at healthy fats as well. And you've probably seen on the news over the years and stuff about when you look at your plate, what do you actually see? And what you're trying to get is a balance across your plate. So ideally, half your plate should be vegetables. About a quarter of your plate should be protein, and then a quarter of your plate should be starchy carbs, or beige carbs, as Aurea said. So one of the things to think about is breakfast. How do you do breakfast, but also what are you looking at? I'm quite new to nutrition in its proper sense. I've exercised for a lot of years, so I always thought I ate healthily until I met Aurea. But one of the things with breakfast for me, I used to eat breakfast cereal quite a lot and then realised how much sugar it had in it. So I've moved now and I eat muesli, but I make my own muesli, so I use oats. But I combine it with nuts and I combine it with seeds and milk as well. And that for me gives me a good sort of mix of the various feed groups, and it gives me a good level of slow release. I'm going to say 5 to 7 days of muesli gets a little bit boring for me, so let's make my own granola, and rather than having milk with that, I have full-fat Greek yogurt, which is a good source of protein. Again, granola, muesli gets a little bit oaty during the week. So I also look at eggs as well. So I've always liked eggs, but I've been even more passionate about it. So I have things like omelettes and do various bits of omelette, sometimes just a plain omelette. My young daughter loves eggs, so she's a boiled egg, keen on boiled eggs. So I join her with a boiled egg occasionally as well. So I guess what I'm trying to do is maintain my protein intake with other things in breakfast, but also to try and mix it up as well, so I'm not getting too bored, which keeps me motivated with breakfast. Clearly, that's easy if you're in the house. I'm on the hoof quite a lot and traveling quite a lot, so it's more difficult. But I've learned to know where I can find things in different shops, different omelettes and things. So that's breakfast. In terms of lunch, so some people skip lunch, some people don't. I think lunch for me is quite important, just in terms of a habit and a routine. But again, I've started to think differently about what I eat for lunch. Used to be really big on sandwiches, so a lot of bread, and as always explained, bread's not necessarily great for our energy levels. So I've moved to more towards salads, and again, looking within a salad, what's in there. So obviously vegetables within salad, but healthy fats, so things like avocado. I like fish, so prawn and avocado salad, something like that. If you're vegetarian, then it's looking at other forms of good protein for yourselves. I think dinner is, for me, dinner's easy because I like cooking. So I've always got things on my mind in terms of what I like cooking. I've always used pasta quite a lot, and again, learned very quickly from learning a little bit about nutrition that pasta is not necessarily great for us in terms of energy levels. So I've looked for some swap outs, which Ori's talked a little bit about, but also thinking about again that combination. So whilst I've not reduced and taken pasta out of my diet, I've used other combinations. So again, first question I ask myself is, where's my protein within that? So chicken, fish, etc. But also trying to reduce sort of animal fats within that. So I've moved towards beans as well, even though I'm not vegetarian. So I look towards butter beans, chickpeas, and so plant-based proteins, just to try and balance that plate out. So again, I guess what we're looking for is half a plate of vegetables, about a quarter plate of protein, and about a quarter plate of starchy carbs. So if we've had good sort of meals during the day and a good breakfast, that gives us sort of good energy levels and balances our blood sugar out, we shouldn't need to snack as much. And sometimes snacking is driven by habit. Sometimes it's actually driven by just our urge to eat. But part of our recharge 45-15 minute strategy and approach, snack might be included in that. So when you're snacking, just think about the things I've spoken about in terms of trying to combine. So one of the things that a lot of people may not know, and one of the go-tos for people, is fruit, fresh fruit. So a really good source of fibre and vitamins, etc. But also contains a lot of sugar as well. So one of the things to think about is to combine that with other things. So actually combining it with nuts, so fruit and nuts, a little bit of yogurt as well. Sometimes actually a few cubes of cheese with grapes. So feel free to snack, but just again, think about the combinations, what it looks like in terms of vegetable, protein, etc. So what I'm going to do now is hand over to Aurea, who's going to talk a little bit more.
Yes, the final thing that I wanted to talk about in relation to this whole topic of blood sugar balance is also around the importance of avoiding processed food. And there's a couple of reasons why that is less helpful when it comes to keeping our energy nice and stable through the day. The first is that processed foods are actually more readily available to us. So because of the treatment that food has to go through in something like a ready meal, actually the calories that we can access from that, the energy, is more than something that we were to make from scratch ourselves because of the way that we cook at home versus what they would do on a mass kind of factory scale. So if you were to, for example, have a portion of cottage pie that you had made yourself versus a bought ready meal, they might theoretically have the same amount of calories, but actually the processed food is much more likely to be more quickly absorbed into the bloodstream, and you're more likely to get all of the calories out of that than you would from the homemade version. The other reason that processed food is not helpful in terms of blood sugar balance is also because it often contains quite a lot of added sugar. And that comes in all kinds of guises in terms of the names that it's given. So it's not always marked as glucose or sucrose. It can also be described as things like glucose syrup, maltodextrin, malt extract, lots and lots of different names that it's given by manufacturers to sort of make it a bit more hidden to us. So we need to watch out for that when we're making our choices. The other thing is that if we go for low fat options, because we think perhaps that's a healthier choice, often we'll find there's also added sugar in those particular options. Because when you take the fat that naturally occurs in a food out, it has a real impact, not just on the flavor of the food, but also on the consistency. So one of the things that's normally put back in to change that back to something which we would find more acceptable is to include more sugar. And so an example there would be going back to Keith's breakfast of his full-fat Greek yogurt. In a product like that, there will be naturally occurring sugars, the lactose in the milk, but there will be also more level of fat, which will be naturally occurring. By contrast to, say, like a low-fat version of a yogurt, where they've taken out more of that naturally occurring fat, and what you'll find is that typically they will add more sugar in. So in that same portion of yogurt, you'll have a much higher proportion of sugar to fat and protein, which will mean that it's more readily absorbed into the bloodstream. So by contrast, even though we think that the low-fat option might be a better option, it might actually cause us to eat more. So even though gram for gram, the full-fat option has more calories in it, it will actually keep us fuller for longer. It will keep our blood sugar nice and balanced. And it's actually, in the long run, likely to make us eat less than to have a sugar-loaded low-fat version, which will add to these spikes and troughs of the blood sugar that we're talking about, may actually cause us to feel more hungry and to eat more, particularly before we get through to our next meal. So just watch out for overall the amount of processed food that's in the diet, because it is something that really does make a difference in terms of that overall balance of energy through the day. So we hope that you've found it useful and interesting to have this exploration of how blood sugar balance in particular is a key strand of our nutritional well-being. But obviously, nutrition is just one element of well-being. It's not just one thing. And actually having good blood sugar balance can actually help our efforts to support our well-being in other areas, including our physical health, because we've got more energy, we feel less tired, perhaps our emotional health because of our mood and our energy that we can put into other activities. So we just want to remind you that it's a symbiotic system. This is one strand, and it will add to our ability to look at our well-being in a rounded way. So thank you very much for joining us and listening along. Do remember, as Keith said, to come back to a regular focus on our nutritional habits to support our well-being. But for now, thank you very much for joining the both of us, and we hope to see you again very soon.